Picture this. You are a Spartan elder in 480 BC, standing on the windswept slopes of Mount Taygetus. The morning air is crisp and thin at this altitude, carrying the scent of pine and the distant sound of eagles circling overhead. In your weathered hands, you hold a newborn baby, its tiny fingers grasping at the rough wool of your crimson cloak. The infant's cries echo off the limestone cliffs that drop away into darkness below. You've made this walk dozens of times before, but today something feels different. This child belongs to one of Sparta's most respected families, a bloodline that has produced kings and heroes. But as you unwrap the swaddling cloth and examine the baby's left foot, your heart grows cold. The foot is twisted, bent at an unnatural angle that marks this child as imperfect in the eyes of Spartan law. You look down at the chasm below, known to your people as the apothete, the place of rejection. Hundreds of feet below, scattered among the rocks and thorny bushes, lie the bones of countless other children who failed Sparta's brutal test of worthiness. This baby, despite its noble blood, despite its parents' wealth and status, despite the tears of its mother who waits at home, will join them. Because in Sparta, there is no room for weakness, no tolerance for imperfection, no mercy for those who cannot contribute to the machine of war that your society has become. What you're about to witness isn't just infanticide. It's the systematic elimination of children deemed unfit for a society that valued military perfection above human life. The Spartans didn't see this as murder. They saw it as necessity, as duty, as the price of creating the most feared warriors in the ancient world. But the reality was far more horrifying than any Hollywood movie has ever dared to show. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. To understand the horror of what happened to Spartan children, you must first understand that Sparta wasn't just a city-state with a strong military. It was a society that had transformed itself into a living weapon, where every aspect of life was subordinated to the single goal of creating perfect warriors. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It was the result of centuries of deliberate choices that gradually stripped away normal human compassion and replaced it with cold, calculating efficiency. The system began with the Mycenaean Wars of the 8th and 7th centuries BC, when Sparta conquered its neighbors and enslaved entire populations. These enslaved people, called helots, outnumbered the Spartans by as much as 10 to 1. Living surrounded by people who wanted them dead created a siege mentality that infected every aspect of Spartan society. They became convinced that only through absolute military superiority could they survive, and that absolute military superiority required absolute sacrifice. This wasn't just about training warriors. It was about breeding them. Spartans began to see themselves not as individuals with inherent worth, but as components in a machine designed for war. Every child born was evaluated not for their potential as a human being, but for their usefulness to the state. Every law, every custom, every ritual was designed to reinforce this single obsession with military perfection. The legal framework that enabled child murder was established by a semi-mythical lawgiver named Lycurgus, though modern historians believe the system evolved over generations. What matters isn't who created it, but how completely it pervaded Spartan society. The killing of imperfect children wasn't done in secret or with shame. It was a public ceremony conducted by respected elders, witnessed by the community, and celebrated as necessary for Sparta's survival. The children targeted weren't just those with obvious physical disabilities. The Spartan definition of imperfection was broad and arbitrary. A birthmark in the wrong place could condemn a child. Slightly delayed development could be fatal. Even children who were perfectly healthy might be eliminated if they cried too much during the inspection, suggesting they lacked the emotional control expected of future warriors. Most disturbing of all, this system had popular support. Spartan mothers were expected to hand over their children for inspection with pride, knowing that elimination was a possibility. Fathers competed to demonstrate their loyalty to the state by showing no emotion when their offspring were condemned. The community celebrated these deaths as necessary sacrifices for the greater good. By 480 BC, when our story takes place, this system had been operating for generations. Thousands of children had already died on the cliffs of Mount Taygetus, and thousands more would follow. But the true horror wasn't just in the individual deaths. It was in how a society convinced itself that murdering children was not only acceptable, but noble. The selection process for Spartan children began before they were even born. Pregnant women were subjected to constant scrutiny, their diets regulated, their activities monitored, their bloodlines examined. The state had invested too much in their warrior breeding program to leave anything to chance. Women carrying children were given specific foods believed to promote strength and courage in their offspring. They were required to exercise regularly and forbidden from consuming anything that might weaken their babies. When labor began, it wasn't just a family event. State officials were notified, and arrangements were made for the mandatory inspection that would determine whether the child lived or died. The birth itself took place under conditions designed to test the baby's strength. Spartan women were expected to deliver their children with minimal assistance, believing that difficult births produce stronger babies. Those who survived the trauma of delivery faced an even greater test. Within days of birth, every Spartan child was brought before the Gerousia, a council of the oldest and most respected men in the community. These weren't medical experts or child care specialists. They were warriors who had survived decades of combat and believed that only the strongest deserved to live. The examination they conducted was thorough and merciless. The elders examined every inch of the infant's body, looking for signs of weakness or deformity. They tested reflexes, observed breathing patterns, and evaluated the child's response to various stimuli. A weak cry could be a death sentence. Excessive fussiness suggested poor emotional control. Even the shape of the child's head was scrutinized, as Spartans believed that certain cranial characteristics indicated intelligence and courage. But the most chilling aspect of this process was its arbitrary nature. The standards weren't medical or scientific. They were based on the personal opinions and cultural prejudices of elderly men who had been raised in the same system of brutality. A child might be condemned because one elder thought their eyes looked weak, or because their skin tone suggested foreign ancestry, or simply because the examining council was in a bad mood that day. Children who passed the initial inspection weren't safe. The testing continued throughout their early years, with regular evaluations designed to weed out those who failed to meet Spartan standards. Boys who developed slowly, who showed fear during training exercises, or who formed emotional attachments to their mothers, could find themselves reclassified as unfit. The threat of elimination hung over every child like a sword, creating an atmosphere of constant terror that shaped their entire development. The rejected children met their fate in different ways, but all equally horrible. The most well-known method was the cliff at Mount Taygetus, where babies were thrown into a chasm called the Imperfect. But recent archaeological evidence suggests this was just one of several elimination methods. Some children were left in the wilderness to die of exposure. Others were drowned in sacred pools. A few were given to Helot families as a form of cruel entertainment, condemned to lives of slavery among the very people the Spartans oppressed. The psychological impact on the families was devastating, and deliberately so. Parents were forbidden from mourning their condemned children. Showing grief was seen as weakness, as lack of commitment to Spartan values. Mothers who cried for their dead babies could face punishment or social ostracism. Fathers were expected to praise the wisdom of the elders who had ordered their children's deaths. This created a cycle of trauma that infected entire generations. Parents who had lost children became more likely to support the system that had killed them, as acknowledging its cruelty would mean confronting their own complicity. Children who survived grew up knowing they lived only at the state's pleasure, that their continued existence depended on maintaining the approval of men who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill. The system also created a class of professional child killers among the Spartan elite. The men who served on the Gerousia took pride in their role as guardians of racial purity. They developed elaborate rituals around the selection process, turning child murder into a sacred ceremony. They competed with each other to demonstrate their hardness, their willingness to condemn even the most borderline cases. What makes this even more disturbing is how the system corrupted the natural bonds between parents and children. Spartan parents learned to view their offspring as temporary loans from the state, subject to recall at any moment. This emotional detachment was seen as a virtue, preparation for the larger sacrifices that military life would demand. The Spartan child elimination system wasn't an aberration or the product of individual cruelty. It was the logical culmination of a society that had subordinated every human value to military efficiency. To understand how an entire civilization could normalize child murder, we must examine the broader cultural and institutional structures that made such practices seem not just acceptable, but necessary. The foundation of the system was the Spartan belief in genetic determinism taken to its most extreme conclusion. They genuinely believed that physical and moral characteristics were inherited in predictable ways, and that by eliminating children with undesirable traits, they could improve their entire population over time. This wasn't ignorance. It was a deliberate eugenic program implemented centuries before the word eugenics was invented. The economic motivations were equally important. Sparta was a society entirely dependent on slave labor, with helots doing all the agricultural and craft work that sustained the population. This arrangement freed Spartan citizens to focus entirely on military training, but it also created an existential threat. The helots vastly outnumbered their masters, and regularly attempted revolts that had to be crushed with extreme violence. In this context, every Spartan citizen was quite literally a soldier in an ongoing war for survival. The state couldn't afford to support anyone who couldn't contribute to the military effort. Children who seemed unlikely to become effective warriors were seen as a drain on resources that could be better used to train and equip those with greater potential. The religious justification for child killing was elaborate and deeply integrated into Spartan spiritual life. The Spartans worshipped gods of war and strength, deities who they believed demanded only the finest offerings. Eliminating weak children was presented as a form of sacrifice, a way of showing the gods that Sparta was serious about its commitment to military excellence. The broader Greek world's reaction to these practices reveals how successful the Spartans were at normalizing their brutality. While some philosophers criticized Spartan child killing, many others praised it as evidence of their superior discipline and commitment to the common good. The system was held up as a model of rational governance, proof that Sparta's military success came from their willingness to make hard choices that other societies were too sentimental to consider. This international approval created a feedback loop that reinforced Spartan practices. When foreign visitors praised their child elimination system, it confirmed Spartan beliefs about their own superiority. When other city-states struggled with internal conflicts or military defeats, Spartans pointed to their eugenic practices as the reason for their own success. The system was also self-perpetuating, because it created the very conditions that seemed to justify its existence. By eliminating children who might have grown up to question militaristic values, Sparta ensured that each generation was more committed to warfare than the last. By removing those who showed emotional sensitivity or intellectual curiosity, they created a population that was genuinely more suited to their brutal way of life. Perhaps most insidiously, the child elimination system was presented as a form of mercy. Spartan propaganda argued that killing weak children spared them from lives of suffering and failure. They claimed that allowing imperfect children to live was actually cruel, as it condemned them to persecution and unhappiness in a society that valued only strength and military skill. This rhetoric of compassionate killing became so deeply embedded in Spartan culture that parents genuinely believed they were acting in their children's best interests by supporting their elimination. Let me tell you about 3 children whose fates illustrate the full horror of the Spartan system. Their names aren't recorded in the historical sources because Sparta didn't bother to document the lives of those it considered unworthy. But their stories, reconstructed from archaeological evidence and fragmentary accounts, reveal the human cost of a society's obsession with perfection. The first child was born to one of Sparta's royal families around 485 BC. His father was a direct descendant of Leonidas. His mother came from equally prestigious bloodlines. Under normal circumstances, this baby would have been destined for greatness, possibly even the throne. But when the Gerousia examined him, they discovered a cleft palate that made nursing difficult and would likely affect his speech development. The debate among the elders was intense. This was royal blood, genes that had produced some of Sparta's greatest warriors. But the deformity was visible and would mark the child as imperfect for his entire life. More importantly, it suggested that even the best bloodlines could produce flawed offspring, a possibility that threatened the entire eugenic foundation of Spartan society. The decision took 3 days, during which the baby remained in a holding area with other children awaiting judgment. His parents were forbidden from feeding or caring for him during this period, as any sign of attachment would be seen as an attempt to influence the elders' decision. When the verdict finally came, it was unanimous. Royal blood couldn't overcome obvious imperfection. The child's elimination was turned into a public ceremony, attended by hundreds of Spartans who came to witness the state's commitment to its principles. His parents were required to watch as their son was carried to Mount Taygetus, and they were praised for their stoic acceptance of the elders' wisdom. The baby's mother later gave birth to 3 more children, all of whom survived the selection process and became distinguished warriors. But palace servants reported that she was never the same, spending hours each day staring at the mountain where her firstborn had died. The second child was a girl born to a middle-class Spartan family in 479 BC. Her father was a professional soldier. Her mother came from a line of strong women who had produced many successful sons. The baby seemed healthy at birth, passing the initial inspections with no obvious problems. But as she grew, it became clear that her development was delayed. At 6 months, she still couldn't hold her head up steadily. At a year, she was far behind other children in reaching basic milestones. The family tried desperately to hide their daughter's condition, keeping her indoors and limiting contact with neighbors who might report her developmental delays. Her mother spent hours each day working with the child, trying to force her to meet normal developmental expectations. But the quarterly inspections that all Spartan children faced made concealment impossible. When the truth was discovered, the punishment extended beyond just the child. The family was condemned for attempting to deceive the state, and their older son was removed from the elite training program as punishment for his parents' disloyalty. The daughter was sentenced to abandonment in the wilderness, a slower and more agonizing death than the quick drop from Mount Taygetus. But this story has a different ending. A group of Helots slaves, working in the fields where the child had been left to die, found her still alive after 2 days of exposure. They took her in secretly, raising her as one of their own. She grew up among the enslaved population, her Spartan heritage hidden, her developmental delays becoming irrelevant in a community that valued survival over perfection. She lived to adulthood and had children of her own, though she could never speak of her origins without risking death for both herself and those who had saved her. The third child was born in 476 BC to parents who already had 2 sons serving in the Spartan military. This baby boy seemed perfect in every way, strong and healthy with no visible defects. But during his first winter, he developed a persistent cough that suggested weak lungs. The family's physician, a trusted friend, warned them that the quarterly inspection would likely result in the child's condemnation. Faced with this prospect, the parents made a choice that would have horrified their neighbors if discovered. They killed their own son, suffocating him gently in his sleep rather than allowing him to face the brutal elimination methods preferred by the state. They reported his death as a sudden illness and held a proper funeral, giving him the dignity in death that Spartan law would have denied him. When Sparta finally fell to Theban forces in 371 BC, one of the first things the victors discovered was the extent of the child elimination system. Theban soldiers exploring Mount Taygetus found the Apothecae chasm filled with centuries of accumulated bones, the skeletal remains of thousands of children who had been deemed unworthy of life. The sight was so disturbing that even hardened warriors, men who had seen countless battlefields, were moved to tears. The immediate aftermath of Sparta's collapse revealed the true cost of their eugenic obsession. The population had been so reduced by generations of child elimination that there simply weren't enough Spartans left to maintain their society. The gene pool had been narrowed to the point where birth defects were actually becoming more common, not less, as the limited genetic diversity led to increased inbreeding among the surviving bloodlines. Those Spartans who survived the city's fall struggled to adapt to a world that operated by different rules. Generations of child elimination had produced a population that was indeed physically strong and militarily capable, but utterly incapable of functioning in peaceful society. They had no economic skills, no artistic traditions, no intellectual pursuits beyond warfare. The very success of their eugenic program had made them evolutionary dead ends. The historical cover-up began almost immediately. Later, Greek historians, embarrassed by this chapter in their civilization's history, began to romanticize Spartan practices while downplaying their most disturbing aspects. The child elimination system was reframed as a rational response to resource scarcity, or as a necessary measure for military effectiveness. The horror was sanitized into admiration for Spartan discipline and commitment. Roman historians, who conquered Greece centuries later, were even more guilty of whitewashing Spartan practices. They transformed the story of child murder into a tale of noble sacrifice for the greater good. The Romans, who had their own issues with infanticide, found it convenient to portray the Spartan system as an ancient example of wise governance, rather than acknowledging it as systematic genocide against their own children. This historical revisionism has persisted into modern times. Popular culture continues to present Spartans as noble warriors fighting for freedom and honor, conveniently ignoring the foundation of child murder that their society was built upon. Movies like 300 portray them as heroes defending civilization, when the reality is that they had eliminated the very humanity that civilization is supposed to protect. The archaeological evidence tells a different story. Excavations at sites throughout ancient Sparta have revealed evidence of the systematic disposal of infant remains, confirming the accounts of ancient historians who wrote about the child elimination practices. Modern forensic analysis of these remains shows signs of violent death and deliberate disposal that supports the historical accounts of children being thrown from cliffs or abandoned in the wilderness. Perhaps most tragically, we're still discovering the extent of the system's reach. Recent excavations have found evidence that child elimination wasn't limited to Mount Taygetus, but occurred at multiple sites throughout Spartan territory, suggesting that the practice was even more widespread than previously believed. The Spartan system of child elimination isn't just ancient history. It represents a pattern of systematic dehumanization that has appeared repeatedly throughout human civilization and continues to manifest in different forms today. Understanding how an entire society convinced itself that murdering children was not only acceptable, but necessary, provides crucial insights into the dangers that modern societies face. The core mechanism that enabled Spartan child killing was the redefinition of human worth based on perceived utility to the state. Once society accepted that some lives were more valuable than others, and that this value could be determined by external authorities, the elimination of those deemed worthless became not just possible, but inevitable. This same logic has appeared in every genocidal movement in human history. Modern genetic testing has created new opportunities for the same kind of selective elimination that Spartans practiced. While our methods are more sophisticated and our justifications more medical, the fundamental question remains the same. Who decides which lives are worth living? The rise of prenatal genetic screening has led to dramatic reductions in the birth rates of children with certain conditions, creating what some disability rights advocates call a new form of eugenics. The Spartan emphasis on military utility finds echoes in modern societies that define human worth primarily through economic productivity. When healthcare systems make treatment decisions based on quality-adjusted life years, when social services prioritize those deemed most likely to become productive citizens, when educational resources are allocated based on perceived potential for success, we see reflections of the same utilitarian logic that drove Spartan child elimination. Perhaps most disturbingly, the Spartan system shows how quickly societies can normalize practices that would have seemed unthinkable to previous generations. The gradual expansion of acceptable reasons for eliminating children, the bureaucratization of the process, and the development of professional classes whose careers depended on the system's continuation all offer warnings about how modern institutions might evolve in dangerous directions. The international praise that Sparta received for their eugenic practices serves as a reminder that evil systems often present themselves as rational, scientific, and progressive. The fact that other Greek city-states admired and tried to emulate Spartan child elimination shows how societies can mistake systematic cruelty for enlightened governance. Return with me now to that windswept cliff where our story began. The Spartan elder stands at the edge of Mount Taygetus, holding a baby whose only crime was being born with a twisted foot. In that moment, he represents more than just one man making a terrible choice. He embodies an entire civilization that had convinced itself that some children deserve to die. The baby in his arms could have grown up to be a poet, a philosopher, a loving parent, or simply a human being deserving of life and dignity. We'll never know, because Spartan society had decided that perfection was more important than humanity, that military efficiency mattered more than compassion, that the state's vision of ideal citizenship was worth any sacrifice. When the elder finally releases his grip and the child falls into the darkness below, something dies with that baby that goes beyond one small life. It's the death of the principle that every human being has inherent worth, regardless of their physical capabilities or their utility to society. The bones scattered in that chasm represent thousands of similar moments, thousands of children whose potential was never realized because they failed to meet arbitrary standards of perfection. Their deaths didn't make Sparta stronger in any meaningful sense. They made it weaker, more brittle, less capable of adapting to changing circumstances. Today, as we face our own questions about genetic testing, healthcare rationing, and the value of different kinds of lives, the ghosts of those Spartan children remind us that the price of perfection is often humanity itself. Their silent voices from the depths of Mount Taygetus whisper a simple but profound truth. Every life has value, and any society that forgets this lesson risks losing its soul. If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you wanting to uncover more buried truths, I've prepared another journey into the shadows of the past that you won't want to miss. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that history tried to erase, and if you found this exploration as compelling as I did, hit that subscribe button so we can continue peeling back the layers of history together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told.